So the one thing that we're going to do slightly differently here is typically we just have a series of speakers and they present just as we've had the previous sessions. But we want to try to do for this last session is have a little bit of more of a roundtable discussion. I don't know if you know, there's a little bit of a theme actually happening over here.
We're wearing this in close.
Did you hear the evil planning? Is that what you heard? The evil?
What's the theme?
Forgot my vest.
Uniforms.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I didn't realize the outfits, but yes. The theme that I was talking about is that, we're all here because we're in the AEC technology space. AEC and fabrication manufacturing. I should include those folks as well, right? We sit at our desks, we develop technology, whether we develop them for the firms that we work for or whether we develop them as products so that others can start to use them. Some of us, like myself included, gone both ways. I was in architecture for a while, I was in tech for a while, I'm in engineering, just started. Still doing tech though, so we're all kind of in this kind of fuzzy, to keep using the word from the previous talk, this kind of fuzzy space kind of in our careers and in our lives. Or at least I feel that way. So we wanted to bring up 4 individuals that have removed themselves from working at an architecture or an engineering firm, but are on the technology side to help kind of inform us a little bit about what their experiences are, technologies they use, how they formulate themselves, and so on and so forth. So with that being said, I'm going to give a brief introduction to the 4 individuals that we have here on stage. And then one of the first questions I'll ask them is to give a little more depth about themselves. So starting from your left to your right, on the far side, we have Jesse DeViet. He's a co-founder of Building Ventures and Borealis Ventures. He leverages his knowledge of the industry to help guide AEC technology firms. He has been involved with firms such as Iris Maps, Tinkercad, and SketchUp. Next, we have Don Henrich, who is the president of Assemble Systems. He has strong interests within the realms of 3D, 4D, and 5D BIM. Right next to him, we have Shane Scranton, CEO and co-founder of Iris VR. It's a New York-based tech company that deals with cutting-edge AR and VR applications specifically for the AEC space. If you haven't demoed their work, definitely do it. And then last but not least, Mustafa Rudasari. Did I get that right?
Yeah, perfect.
Co-founder of Ladybug Tools. He's a designer, he's a software developer, he's an educator, and he focuses on the integration of parametric environmental analysis. So to kind of kick it off, as I said, the first question I want to ask you, maybe we could start with Jesse and kind of work our way this way, is briefly introduce yourself and kind of define your company and your business model, how you started. Like, how did you get into where you are today?
Yeah, but like a lot of journeys in life, professionally, sort of by accident in many ways. So I don't know if that's working or not. But in 1988, I was in the startup community in the Boston area, and a friend of mine in a startup where we were struggling, frankly, to build a business came to me and said, "Hey, I just came back from a computer show, and I won a door prize at this Connex computer show with this product called AutoCAD. Have you ever seen this before?" And I was like, "Oh, I've never seen that. It sounds like a really good idea." I was an environmental and public affairs person before that, and so he said, "Autodesk really wants to set up new resellers in Boston. Are you willing to help?" And I said, "I'll try to help a little bit in that." And just after that, AutoCAD with Autolist came out, 2.17F. And Autodesk asked me, "Hey, do you know anybody that could write custom Lisp routines?" And I said, "I know a civil engineer and surveyor who I think could write some routines and make it work with your new AutoCAD." And we did that, and they did that. They previewed that in a room full of 400 people. And I'll never forget the moment. Some of the questions here are about how do you know when products take and so forth. The room went silent when the road profile started to draw itself, right? You'll never forget that moment in time when that happened. And that's when I thought to myself, wow, this is big. The guy demonstrated came off the stage and asked what happened. Everyone went quiet. I'm like, no, that was a good quiet. The room sort of fell silent. So after that, they convinced me to start a software company. We took venture capital in '91. We created a software company called Sofdesk. It became Autodesk's largest partner with architecture, engineering, construction applications built on the AutoCAD platform. We went public in 94, Autodesk bought us in 96, and we formed something called the AEC Market Group. So actually, Don's going through a similar exercise at Autodesk now. I know you're realizing this when you hear this story, but I went through it in the late 90s, and we created the AEC Market Group. After that, I wanted to do something different when I sort of served my time, if you will, and wanted to get back to creating companies. And we had taken venture capital. We'd had mixed experience, frankly, and I thought, I don't know if I want to do that. A couple of venture firms tried to recruit me to join. And I thought, I don't really want to go to that dark side. I've been there before, but I want to build companies. And I thought I could do it if I did it on my own terms, maybe. And so we started a venture firm. And that was called Borealis Ventures in 2000, 2001. And then in 2002, Brad Shell called me from Boulder, Colorado, who had kind of had, I would say, maybe not the best treatment in his Autodesk span when I was there. I felt bad about some of it. And Brad called me and said I owed him a favor. And would I come to Boulder and spend time with him on this SketchUp thing? And I never forget, after a week, I called my co-founder, Phil, back, and I said, remember I told you how I never wanted anything to do with AEC software ever again after a dozen years? I said, I think we should do the SketchUp investment. And that was 2003. And so since then, we've made about 50 investments as a firm, about 20 around the built environment. And to bring us up to date today, really have seen this market change in the last 3 years as it's become more of a mainstream marketplace. All the work that you do is not just in industry annals, if you will, or professional documents now. It's in Fast Company. It's everywhere now. So there's really been, in my view, a mainstreaming effect of the industry. And so it's bigger now. It's almost like, I'll never forget when Carol Bartz told me that AEC will be big enough, Jesse, when it gets big enough as a vertical that falls over and becomes a horizontal market. And I've reflected back on that in the last couple of years, feeling like a lot of the new technologies are enabling what has been somewhat of a sleepy vertical industry to become much more broad and really impact the way our world works. And the other dynamic that's given us the ability to create new funds and a new venture firm around this, building ventures, is that the outside forces have changed too. Right? We all know in this room we don't live really in a sustainable world. I mean, we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. There's some nasty intersections of population growth and urbanization ahead of us. Those are fuel, I think that's fuel to the fire that can help drive the market and adoption of technology. That's what's inspired as investors for us to create a new firm dedicated to the market. And that's what we're doing today. We're venture capitalists to invest, but also to build companies as part of our strategy. So.
Cool.
So even though I have the same kind of vest on, I'm actually not part of Jesse's firm, but Jesse has invested in companies that I either started or was involved with 2 times post the SketchUp experience. I think I've started 5 companies, 3 that I'd like to talk about, 2 that I probably would not. But you know, it's been really a lot of fun doing it, and in the last 15 years I've kind of focused on the construction space. I started, those of you who know ArchiCAD, I started kind of dabbling in ArchiCAD in 2002 or 3, and that kind of made me look at construction because we were sitting there thinking about the ArchiCAD business. I was an employee of Graphisoft at that time, and we kind of were, how can we grow this business fast? And then we looked at the AEC environment and we said, where's all the money? And it's kind of, you know, just roughly speaking, for 100% of a project, 10% of it goes to kind of the design team, 10% of it goes to the contractor, and, you know, 80% of it builds the building, right? So, and the contractor generally controls those funds. So we were like, maybe that's where the money is, and maybe that's where we should focus on helping change the industry. So we built a product at Graphisoft that is called Constructor Pro. You can no longer get that, I don't believe, but it's probably still running somewhere. Then we left after the company was acquired and started a company called Vico Software, which was pretty revolutionary. We built a product on top of Revit. Actually, it was to work on any product, on any CAD software. So we built an independent product that could read formats. And Vico created construction estimates, construction clash detection, construction schedules, and kind of correlated them all and kept them, you know, kind of perfectly synchronized, which, as you probably know, in the drawing and in the AEC space, there's a lot of synchronization that isn't done really well today. That company we sold to Trimble. I worked there for a few years and learned a lot about hardware and things like VR that we'll talk about today. And then went to Assemble Systems, which was really very lightweight and kind of, I think the biggest takeaway in the AEC space is make it so easy if you can. Assemble was very easy to use, very easy to buy, very easy to deploy. It was a cloud product. And it just did really well. The company did well. And we were acquired by Autodesk in July. And now I'm inside a group inside of Autodesk that is going to energize the kind of Autodesk army to focus on the construction space, and really deploy a lot of its intellectual property, its resources, and its people to helping change the world of construction. And I think that's going to come a lot faster than we think.
Great. So I'm Shane. I started at a two-person architecture firm as the architectural intern and the rendering guy and the BIM guy, and then I upgraded to a 10-person architecture firm. These were both in Vermont, so they were very small projects. And from there, I sort of found that I was getting these jobs through my BIM and rendering and 3D knowledge in general. So I spun off and started a consulting gig that was primarily in New England, doing a lot of BIM implementation. So a lot of those projects fail, learned a lot about process. And then right around 2013, if you guys remember, the Oculus Rift had a really successful Kickstarter that was sort of the first VR prototype of this generation of technology. And I am a gamer, so I got a kit not planning on using it for architecture. And right when I got it, I just put one of my SketchUp models in and showed my now co-founder, who was a classmate of mine. And we thought that was pretty cool. We thought it was a really interesting way to engage with space. We weren't really sure if it was a thing, so we went to a lot of the architects I'd worked with, and then from that got intros into some of the bigger firms in Boston and New York. And after that first 6 months of showing demos of that first prototype, it wasn't a great prototype. It was the headsets made you sick. It was kind of a bad piece of technology, but it showed a sense of space and a sense of scale, and we came off of that trip with just a tremendous amount of excitement we saw in the industry for this technology, because you could finally communicate space to people who can't read plans and who don't understand renderings. So we started taking VR very seriously at that point in 2014, and I'll fast forward a bit because we'll talk about the details, but now we're about 30 people in Manhattan. We're building software for primarily next generation design review, coordination, and VDC workflows. We work across architecture, construction, and engineering, and we're delivering essentially software that we deploy pretty much every 8 weeks to 12 weeks, and are iterating on this new industry of AR and VR.
I'm Mustafa here. I'm co-founder of Ladybug Tools. As a company, we are very young. We started January this year, and we doubled in size from just this month, from 1 person to 2 person. We're kind of competing with WeWork on that. Very, very hard, very close.
Big comparables for next year, though.
Right, yeah, hopefully. So, yeah, the story is, my background is architecture. I did architectural design. I worked on construction sites for a while. I got interested in environmental building design back home. Worked a little bit, saw it's not going to work. Nobody pays us for environmental simulation. The tools at the time was not really that good. I came back, went to school here, 2010, went to Penn for a master's in environmental building design. The idea was I'm going to automate everything and go back. I automated a lot of things, and then I started working for architecture offices. I worked for Adrian Smith Gordon Gill. And out of frustration, I started writing some scripts to automate the stuff for environmental building design, modeling, simulation. Did a lot of optimization, like all this stuff that people showed here. I realized they're not helpful to design process if you don't educate people. And that was the time that I started writing a plugin that's called Ladybug. Released it in 2013, January, from a startup in Chicago, from a Starbucks in Chicago. And yeah, I remember because I went to bathroom and threw up. I felt like, nah, this thing is going to blow up people's computer tomorrow. And project was open source from the start. It has been open source. It started growing. After Ladybug, we had Honeybee, then Butterfly, then recently Dragonfly. Now we have a Spider, and it's going on.
Cool. So I want to kick off with a question about, there's a lot of different technologies that you're all working with. And there's a lot of different technologies that were presented here today. When some new piece of technology comes into the industry, how do you vet it? How do you know that something is actually usable for the AEC space, or how do you know it's a fad? How do you know we've gone beyond the hype curve and now we're at a point where it's actually usable and functional, right? The VR thing is a pretty common one. Very early on, VR, and they were like, all right, what do we do with it, right? Even at my old office, when I was in architecture, I had all these headsets, and everyone's just trying to scramble how to use it. So how do you vet new technology that comes in our space, in the AEC space? What are some of the things you take into consideration?
I mean, we try to work to listen to the customers at the end of the day, right? I think, so oftentimes we'll see powerful technologies, but it's maybe not thought through as a genuine solution, right? So I think for us, it's we have to sort of support it being in the wild, sponsor it going to people we know in the industry, in our case, could be an architecture, engineer, or construction firm, and then see what happens. We do that. I would say that's the most frequent activity I do every week now, sponsoring I never forget when we sponsored Shane to go to Boulder for a meeting with the SketchUp people originally, right?
2014.
Is this thing really real or not? And of course, by the way, you'll enjoy what happened afterwards. Like, they called me afterwards and they said, well, we're not sure what to make of those guys. I'm like, what do you mean? They're awesome. And they're like, no, we got in a big argument over craft beer.
Yeah.
And these guys would not throw down. And the meeting almost ended as an argument over Vermont versus Colorado. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
So you have to be careful what you recommend to happen. But I think anyway, so the great thing about having a network is we send people out in real life, whether it's users of it or whether it's other firms or other people. That's one way that we sort of sort it out.
Yeah. I think, similar to Jesse, I think the customer is really the most important person. And so the sooner you can get there, if you have an idea or a prototype, historically a lot of founders are trying to hold things very closely and keep them secret and all this, what is it called, stealth mode. I think the best thing to do is really go and visit with some people you feel, you trust, that are knowledgeable, and talk it through with them, and, let them poke holes in it, and then you really just listen, right? And I've found in those conversations, you really begin to develop kind of, it's not a sixth sense, but a sense of this is something people could really use, or this is very cool, but maybe it's either, some of the companies I'm not proud of is a little ahead of their time, right? And so, you just kind of get that feeling, and then you have to kind of go with your gut.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen a lot of this firsthand where most technology starts unusable, and there is sort of that iteration that you move through, and a lot of the question is timing of who's ready for it when. And I think there are different types of people that are better prepared for broken technology and prototype technology. And then I think that's sort of on the usability side. Everyone ultimately wants to trend towards one click and ease of use, if they're doing it right, I believe. And then I think on the other side, there is, is your hypothesis really grounded in value you're bringing to the customer? I mean, you sort of have to start with, like, there is value here if we build the dream, and then finding how you can deliver increments of that value that you can show to the customer along the way. And I think it's very easy for founders a lot of times to have the vision, and then what the first thing they put out is a broken spreadsheet. To go from there to a fully usable product, I think that's the dance, and finding evangelists along the way that promote it.
Yeah, I think this is not a problem only for venture capitals. One of the ones that I really liked is like how people, so they did a research on understanding which show is going to be really successful on TV. So one of the things that they do this, like they start making some, and they ask people to come and like vote and all those. And they realize actually, if you go to the end user, that's not really the best way. And it wasn't that successful. So what they realized at the end was the best evaluation that they got was from the similar people who are doing that in the same industry. So when they asked them to come and see this prototypes in a way and say, like, what do you think about this show? The ideas that they had was very successful. Like learning from them, I think for us is always going back to our community of experts that we have around the tools. And I think they are the ones who, most of the time, they really know because that's what they're doing and they feel it. And yeah, sometimes, and when we started, it was mostly about what can we do. Now it's mostly about like, can we maintain it at the end of the day? So even if it's something that is really helpful or something, I'm not in a position to give them money and go do something because we have to do it ourselves. So I think our perspective is a little bit different. We just first evaluate from our community of experts, like how valuable they think this is, and then we think, can we maintain it, or do we have someone in the community to maintain it, and that's how we go for it.
Cool. So you each touched upon, this topic of communication, being able to communicate with the end users, communicating with other industry peers. I mean, within our space, we do peer reviews, right, of our drawings, and sometimes it's external, sometimes we hire external firms, right? So maybe we should kind of learn something from that on the tech side too. But how do you determine, when there is a fit for what you're doing and when you're not? How do you know if you're too ahead of the game? Which we all love to think we are there, but sometimes that could be pretty bad. Or how do you know that it's something you should just kind of drop and kind of move on with something else?
I think there's, in the startup vocabulary, everyone's talking about product market fit, and what we've sort of learned over the years as we hear that thrown around is, really what it means is you have a robust business model that people are going to gravitate towards, and for us, that's just speed of adoption. I think that with a really good evangelist team, you can push a lot into the market, you can push a lot into the workflows. When you start seeing a speed of inbound interest, and I know VR has sort of followed a hype cycle that we've seen that organically happen just through hype, but when it breaks free of the hype cycle and that speed sort of accelerates word of mouth of what you're offering, I think a lot of that fits with sort of overall product market fit. But I think in the industry, like, you can tie this to architecture, you can tie this to construction, in also how those firms are representing their business models to the end client, and if demand is starting to build up for those services. And I think you can pinpoint firms that sort of also represent product market fit in pace of inbound demand. And I think that threshold is also a judgment call, but we've heard a lot of startups just to sort of describe, it when you see it. There's sort of this point where suddenly there becomes this magnet to the tool, and we.
I would say it's what people are willing to pay for, right? I mean, that's the ultimate test at the end of the day. I mean, this industry, we get presentations every day in our email, and honestly, if it's in the construction space, as an example, I can tell you what the 10 logos on our first pilot customers' logos are, because they're all the same 10 customers, right, as an example. So the question for us is, who's going beyond pilots? When is it beginning to take? And in most cases, to go beyond pilots, someone in that business has had to make a business decision that it's important enough to what they're doing in their practice or in their construction firm that it's meaningful. So it's beyond just tech appealing and interesting. It actually fits into what they're doing and how they're serving their customers. And that's when we begin to believe as investors there's something more than just technology. Yeah.
And this industry has like an insatiable demand for solutions because there's just so many problems because of the nature of our supply chain, and AEC is very different from almost any other industry on the planet, and yet it's one of the biggest industries. So there's an insatiable demand to solve problems, but like Jesse said, and was said earlier, it's important that you don't let a false positive, hey, one guy bought one, let's roll, let you influence you too much. You have to really see that there is adoption and there is some kind of wave, to your kind of surfer. There's a wave that you can ride.
I mean, having the luxury of not having any investors.
Freedom.
Yeah,
that's true.
We have.
It's the most expensive money, I'll confess, at the end of the day.
Yeah, so we are we are not market driven in a way, and the way we understand, and again, like being an open source project, having the luxury of having failure as a part of the process. We have a core functionality that we know, and everything else that comes, again, goes through our community, because it comes from the community, and we have this discussion online about like, what do you think, how should it happen, and then like I think we have been good in giving something a try, and then see if it's valuable or not, and unlike others, I think we don't really need to see how many people are using it, if that community of experts that, again, I say, like, for every single feature, like it's going to be different people from the community. If they agree this has the potential and this should be done, we usually get it done. And again, like we are very fine with failing and then
But that's
going
usage
back.
too, right? I mean,
Yeah, that's
that's another view of usage, right? In other words, if no one used what you put out there, it'd be hard to
Well,
know that's valuable, but you're really doing the most organic version of that.
Right, but we know people will use it when it's done. That's the difference, you know, like we don't, so something like what we're doing right now, for example, we're rewriting some daylighting libraries that out of like people, maybe 10% even know why we're doing this.
Yeah.
But we know in 3 years, this is what you need. You know, like if I want to go with market, like what we have already as legacy plugins are well, like above what we need to even make like a whole consultancy around it. But I think that stops us from like, you know, seeing ahead of what is possible and what are the things that are real issues that we have. And again, I think the other difference is like, we are the first users of our tools, right? So we are developing for ourselves first and then other people later. So I think there are a lot of things that, I mean, I like the startup culture, but intentionally we never went through that because I see this pattern of do it fast, do it fast, do it fast so investors can make more money. And then now, if you can't do it, you're dead. Okay, you guys, you're the young one, come here. You do it now, next one. I mean, I know it works, but like as a matter of fact, like 9 of 10 startups are failing, right?
Sure.
And then you're still thinking like, do you want to be in that race, hoping for that one? Or do you want really to do something that you think is going to be meaningful and then you will make enough money, but money is not the objective, you know, money and like users and profit is the constraint. The objective is like doing the thing that we, in our case, is like to enable the industry to explore the options for environmental building design. I think here is a little bit of difference because we are having an open source business model and no investors.
That's kind of
But
why
I think that's not so disconnected, by the way. I really admire that, and I think that's actually what the industry can really use, right? Because one of the things about this industry, it's so hard because it's so project-based and so forth, and the nature of your business models here, there's a lot of technology and startups that won't get advanced because they're not going to get the funding, they're not going to get the adoption. It's really hard. A lot sort of dies on the vine, if you will. So the ability to get more out there, get more experientially going. But on the other hand, you know, if you want the world to be able to use something, right, I can reflect back on the SketchUp decision to even be acquired, right? It was really heart-wrenching for that team to decide their idea was democratize 3D, make it available to everyone.
Sure.
At that point in time, we didn't have the sort of infrastructure you have now where people can get it easy and use it. But even the decision as to who they sold to, the idea was that, you know, we have to maintain our mission. Today, there is no other 3D product that will be used more than SketchUp will be today in the world.
I agree.
Right? So even though it may seem like they sold out in the concept of venture capital and so forth, those founders feel like their mission was completed in the sense that, you know, they delivered this tool to market, which has worldwide usage, right? Not because of the venture capitalists, by the way. I mean, we're way overrated in terms of what we do. That's another point, another discussion, right? But I think actually what you're doing, and when I follow what the High-Power team is doing on open source, you might have even just seen Bentley made some open source announcements. I'll kind of maybe believe that one when you look a little closer. But, you know, I think it's great, and the industry needs that, because without that, we're not going to get the sort of usage and cross-pollination
Sure.
that we need as well. So
I like that and I agree. I think like one comment that I have there is, I see success not in having more users, is in having more good users. You know, like what we are trying, and now like by luck or whatever, we are just like really popular in at least in what we do. We are like the third most downloaded Grasshopper plugin, which whenever I say it, I scare like the hell out of me. It does. but at the same time, you know, like a thing is like, do you want to keep like having more users, or do you want to have more good users who can basically help this community to be a better community, which at the end of the day, a better community of experts are going to design better buildings, and then like that's what we really want to do. So it's, there is a discussion always here, like, you know, like we doubled in size, well, what does that mean? You know, like the same thing about like, we have like more, like we have tens of thousands of users, so what does that mean for the building industry at the end of the day? I think if we can, I don't know if there is a way to say like we have like 200 power users or some users that we made that they can really use this tool for good. I think that would be the most valuable thing, but like that's really hard to measure,
ultimately,
right?
your greatest value to the industry might be the fact that the changing nature of the way the industry is enables more people to capture their own IP and their own talent and deliver it and win right, because we know the industry is challenged professionally in terms of what's happening, right? And so I think that's another advantage of what you do, is you enable more people to do that, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if both are like mutually exclusive in the sense that there are so many specialized applications in this industry. Like there are so many specific workflows that will really benefit a core user group, and sort of there is a lot of open source communities and a lot of small dev teams that can answer those specific requirements in really elegant and advanced ways that larger companies can't, at least until they're really big and they have like a labs team and they can put resources towards essentially really catering to these very, very specific workflows. And I think that is the balance. I think there are inherently general tools like SketchUp that do service a lot of base needs, but when you need to start doing something advanced in SketchUp, you go to the plugin library, you go to the tools that have been built by smaller teams. Like I think they do complement each other in a lot of senses.
You mentioned open source, right? So when I was in the tech side, some of our stuff was open source, and we debated opening source some other things. My biggest concern is like, well, how do we manage it? Because it was going to all fall on me. But how do you deal with kind of open source technologies? How do you there's a number of technologies that were presented today that are open source, and actually, Mustafa, you worked on some of the stuff at TT, which is open source. Like, how do you start to manage an open source project, right? How do you start to, how do the individuals that contribute or use the open source technology start to see value in what you're doing?
So let me make a distinction between two things, and between open source project and making something open source. I think we confuse them sometimes. To me, an open source project is a project that people build with each other, right? And there's a community around this thing that gets built. Yes, the code source is available, and that's why we call it open source, but the community around the open source is what makes that open source project valuable and successful. The other thing is we did all this thing done, we open sourced it, and now people help. It's open source, it's cool. Why don't you help us? It's not about ops, there's a lot of code all over the web. That doesn't mean community, that doesn't mean open source project. So when I talk about an open source project, I mean the one that is built by a community for a community. And in that sense, it's like any other community that survives. It's a trust-based workflow that at least we have. You just earn it by working your way up. You take from answering 10 questions to just contributing the first component or something, and then writing the library, getting right access and all those. And I think there is a healthy, they say there's a 20-80% rule, that 80% of the code is written by 20% of contributors. Where we have, and like any other community, I think one of the things that people think is about getting more developers is really about getting people to help you to manage the community and help you survive on maintenance, not development, because that's the main challenge with open source. But I think that's on the technical side. On the side of your question was on the money too, or
Well, I try to stay away from the concept of money
Okay.
for a number of reasons. No, because I was on the tech side too, and
Okay.
I had a CEO that said, "Hey, we need to meet these sales figures," and I have no idea where they came from. So I don't want to go in terms of the money side of things, but I want in terms of value. I'll give you an example, right? This shirt right now is very valuable to me, because if I don't have it, I have no shirt on, and it'd be a little embarrassing, right? But when this shirt is in my closet, it's less valuable because I have another shirt on, right? I always define value that way. So how do you get the industry to see value in what you're doing? You're specific. It's open source, right? So anyone can say, well, I'm gonna go take it and compile it and use it on my own, right? So how do you get them to
that's
come back a little
that's
bit?
a
and be part of
major
that community?
challenge. I mean, sorry, it's because it's open source. I'm not going to be the only ones, you guys.
Just to comment on the business side. So in our last business, or the Assemble business, it was a kind of for-profit venture, and it was a startup and all those things. But we did utilize open source where there was good open source available for us. And so just on the business side, you do have to manage that. And so we basically kept a running list of what we'd used, and there is I'm trying to remember the name. I think it's called a Black Horse scan.
Black Duck.
Black duck, thank you. I knew it was black something. There's a black duck scan you can do, every so often on the code base, and it will actually find all the things. It's very good at finding, browses the code and finds all the things that are open source and make sure you have properly given credit for those.
Right.
Whether it's either just, disclosing that you're using them or you're paying for using them, whichever. So that's something that can be managed and, but does require some attention. And open source is extremely valuable. What I would say too about the business model is that when there's enough open source, it's another business, it's kind of typically another business model. If you look, kind of go back to Red Hat, right? They built such a great community of Unix experts that it became, they built a business on top of that that's now running a great deal of the data centers on the planet. And it's an enormous business, but it's still a great deal of the code is open source, right? So there are just kind of different forms of the business models that emerge from these things. But open source is a great way to build a community and to contribute value to a community if that's, if that's helpful.
I think the main challenge that we have in the industry right now, I'm talking just about building industry, is we are still competing in a level of my Excel spreadsheet is better than your Excel spreadsheet. And then even inside offices, people are like my team is better than your team. And the level is I have a script that puts the layers of CAD in a way that you can't do that, takes you 2 days. So as long as we are there, because, and I want to talk about this predictive algorithms, like AI, machine learning. There are predictive algorithms, there are I don't know how many dollars of industry, they're huge. All the libraries out there, that all these tools that they're using are open source. And a lot of people who are developing those tools are now hired by the companies who are using that technology. They're not competing in a level of source code and library, they're competing in a level of applications on top of the source code. And what has happened is they agreed that if we work together to make the libraries better, then we can make better applications on top of it. And it doesn't mean because we helped each other to make this library, now because you can use the code that I contributed, you also can use it, then I'm going to be behind. Because there is another layer of competition that we're missing. I think for building industry, the challenge, and I know this because when we started, we were hoping that to be that platform for the building industry, and because we have been doing this for before we started the company for 5-6 years, so people knew that we're doing this and we're capable in everything, so we didn't have to go and have an elevator, what they call elevator pitch? Mm-hmm. What's that thing? Yeah, we didn't need that, or we didn't need to go to convince people this is useful because they were already using it. So we just went there and said hey, we want to do this, help us contribute to this project, we can work on this full time, and everybody can benefit. And what we realized is in building industry, unfortunately, the concept of win-win is not still there. There are individuals in the companies who like that.
Right.
But the whole infrastructure is designed based on if I win, everybody else needs to lose. Yeah. Because the idea is there is one project, I can win it or you can win it. But that's not really how it is with technology. And there are a lot of services, they're not non-existent at the point, right? You just make it when you have something. So yeah, I think for building industry, we need a shift of mentality shift, and we need a shift in infrastructure, which goes to contracts, lawyers, how
there's a huge business model shift underway, and actually the industry is sort of flipping upside down. Just as a venture capital investor who's investing a lot of capital and other people's capital in this industry, it's sort of a really unique moment in time, I would say too, right? It's kind of a scary moment in time for some people. I've presented at a large firm Roundtable twice this year, and you can see the room almost divided in half. Half the people are thinking we got to run the clock out, half the people are leaning in, got to figure out how to rebuild businesses, how it all works. I've shared with some people the story that we began working on our new investor set, and I had no idea so many construction companies would come at the table, right? Well, I'm just telling you that when construction companies are getting involved in venture capital and all these things, it's a moment in time that they see an opportunity to seize, if you will, more of the process, right? And we have the vertical integration, look at the impact of WeWork, look at the impact of Katerra in construction. I mean, there's other forces larger than this conversation that have an impact, I think, on this conversation in some ways too, that are actually changing this industry to make it an exciting time at the same time as a little bit of a scary time, as I said earlier. I don't know if people agree with that or not, but I see it as an investor in the space, that there's bigger movements happening. They're kind of hard to all figure out right now, but there's an unsettled nature and a shifting of power balance happening at the same time.
I think we
That
all.
sort of killed the conversation.
No, yeah. That was good. I would just agree with Mustafa. I came from the mechanical industry, people who make cars and airplanes with CAD software and, CAM software. And those people work together, but it's because their business is different. If you're gonna, make the seats for a Ford truck, you're gonna make them for you get a 5-year contract, and you make all their seats, or you make a great deal of their seats. And so there's a real spirit of collaboration there. The biggest problem we have in AEC, which has not gone away and doesn't seem like it's going to go away in the near future, is that every time there's a project, once someone wins, they establish the supply chain that moment in time for that project. And so it could be, you could be asked to use different software, you could be asked to work with people you compete with. It's just all thrown together at the last moment, kind of. And that's just really complex to fix. And that's why some of the vertical integration, the Rad Urbans, the WeWorks that Jesse mentioned, and others are they show some hope for other ways to build buildings that, might solve some of the problems we suffer as a society. So, but it is a really difficult industry that does have to change.
I hope.
Despair.
Well, I think it takes leading firms. Obviously, I'm going to give a little shout out to Thornton Tomasetti. They deserve more than that, obviously. But I mean, it takes firms willing to take the chance to support all these things. So we have a lot of strategic investors who are AEC firms in our venture fund. And one of the messages I try to convey to them is, if you want the best startups and you want more technology, you have to support these, right? Otherwise, it's so hard to get anything really adopted and invest enough to have the right talent to build something out, right? So everybody has to contribute to it, including the firms themselves, by actually trying this stuff out and putting it in use.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think this is a good time to give a shout out to kind of how Design Explorer worked. And, we had this discussion and Rob agreed to be open source and everything. And today, we saw, now, having Design Explorer open source, and the fact, for example, Autodesk started Project Fractal, which was very similar. And then now, what was it? What was the name, Zach? Refinery. And Refinery, which is in a similar area, and then seeing Thread, which is again Design Explorer 2.5. In a way, you can see that the main discussion again is if the industry agrees that we need if you see it like a tree, the root and the trunk, the main trunk should be shared. It doesn't stop you from branch out and make your branches that can be that now Thread is not open source. And to me, as a person who was part of the starting Design Explorer, I don't feel bad about that necessarily. I think Design Explorer did its job. Other people are using it, and now somebody picked it, did something better. That's their decision to make it contribute back or not. But anybody else can take it and make a new branch and do the stuff. And I think that's when the real innovation happens, because you don't have to rebuild all this root, trunk to get to that branch. You can just branch out from this thing. And I think that's where the whole building industry can really value from open source. And I think other industries have figured it out to some extent, as I said an example.
Yeah.
We have to hopefully figure it out. Okay, it's just a pessimist guy with an accent here. So, I mean, I don't know, you have more experience that you can say, I'm probably wrong, but I kind of feel, I see the whole building industry like a dinosaur and a vegetarian dinosaur. I say why. So it's very slow, it moves slow, but it's not going to die, and it's going to survive. The only way it's going to die is if there is a very major change. And sometimes what we try to do, we say, oh, this dinosaur, let's make it fly. Let's just implement 2 wings on top of the dinosaur and let it fly. Yeah. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think this building industry as it is going to change. I don't think they really need us, I'm talking about myself, as that small thing that wants them, because we are dinosaurs. like the industry is a dinosaur.
But there's
So-
outside forces, I think, that are bigger, if I
Did
could
you
just make
think-
that case for a second. And I've been out in these financial rooms over the last year talking about this industry, and some people have said, one sort of famous person won't go by name in Silicon Valley said to me, tell me everything you know about AEC in 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, he said, I don't want to know anymore. You can leave now. It's really hard. I didn't realize this is sort of that hard, but actually, I can tell you just by the inbound calls and everything else happening, more and more focus is on this. There's more challenges in the world that are going to drive more change. I joined something at the Urban Land Institute this year. We formed something called the Technology and Real Estate Group, and there was 2 venture capitalists and 18 real estate developers. The number one topic at the formation dinner was Katera, which was the last thing I expected to be there, but now you have the owners. So you have people, essentially, they're going to own or finance these projects who now have more visibility into the projects. They care more about it. They want to get something in the ground up in 24 months, as an example, and the building industry doesn't deliver that because of some of this friction that you're capturing too, which is not just people doing wrong. Some of it's just the nature of the business model and the way things work. So there's bigger forces at work that are going to apply pressure that I believe will drive more change. That's my belief as an investor, I should say.
I hope
That
the
it's not
dinosaur.
always just from within, it's from without. The pressure from outside is
could-
going to force new practices.
Probably fly with 3 wings, if you put 3 wings.
I don't know.
Yeah.
You
I'd invest
should, you
in
should
that.
fly from
Yeah,
the
yeah.
ashes, like, you know.
Yeah. Well, to continue the analogy, just to tie it all together, I think the dinosaur is starting to want wings. I think everything else is flying right now, and I think that I think that you can sprout wings, little wings, and then increment on them. And I think
Yeah.
I'm really going into this metaphor. But
You know that there are dinosaurs who fly, but they're not vegetarian. That's why I said that.
yeah, exactly. So,
Dinosaur was vegetarian.
well, yeah, we're gonna push through it. But I think it's the incremental change that I think is like we've seen a lot of interop plays. Whether when you're talking about sort of the sprouts off of open source code bases, I think there's also sort of sprouts off of workflows where we now have the start of a centralized model. I'll give it that credit. And people want to return to that, and then they want to build off that, and like we don't want to pull away from the trends that are happening. And I think it's figuring out how you can create incremental change on top of the need that is forming. That is sort of the dance we have to play to get to a modernized space.
Cool. I want to open this up to the audience and see if there's anybody here. Zach, there is a microphone down here. You can get it real quick. Yes.
Hi, thanks. I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to try and be careful because I have an opinion about it. And I'm not going to say open source, but rather talking about intellectual property, because I think that there's a long time span that we're also looking here at when people have had stuff that they have made that can be consumed by their competitors.
Yep.
Whether it's when people were making auto list routines,
Yep.
and how different offices have felt about sharing them or not sharing them with the community to where we are now. And you guys have all sort of been in a lot of offices, and I'm guessing that a lot of people have come up to you and said, we made this cool thing. Like, how do we lock it up? Or, we made this cool thing, how do we sell it? Or how do we make this cool thing available to everybody? And how do you counsel people about when to do one or the other or something else entirely?
I'll start. That's a toughie. In the construction world, when we would bring ideas to construction companies, often the general response is, "Hey, we like this idea. We'll help you with it, but then we want to own half or 70% or all of it. We want to own the IP." And they have a day job doing construction. You have no other job other than building IP. So that those two forces kind of butt heads. There are ways to partner. Kind of the best ways are to find things that are valuable and license them out. And there are companies that specialize in licensing out things that you can reuse. And I think that's a lot of software companies, including ours, take advantage of that. But it is kind of a sticky wicket as to who owns the IP. I would say, I teach entrepreneurs as well as my kids, bad news first, right? So, you typically in companies, people come, I have good news and bad news, but they'll tell you the good news first because they want to soften you up because the bad news is really bad, right? And so, with IP, it's got bad news first. Like, if you want to own it all because you're the developer of it or whatever, say that right up front. Say, look, I'm willing to work with you on this, but I want to own it, or I want to open source it, or whatever, or I'm willing to share it with you under the following terms. But do that really early, because IP is something that gets a lot of legal attention later on if you don't handle it well.
I have a couple thoughts. By the way, and for disclosure purposes, you may not want to do this, Charlie, but Charlie and I were on the Flux journey together. I'm still there, thank you. But anyway, we're still working on that. But we had a lot of these early ideas there, right? And I think it's going to take a few attempts to really create what I think the industry deserves, which is a next-generation design platform that enables people to capture more of their intellectual property and then decide whether or not it's shared or whether it's deployed as an advantage. So I think that's a real opportune area. Honestly, as an investor, I've got my eyes open for something like that, and I think there's only another analogy I would share is that Rude Management, New York City company you would all know well, John Gilbert runs that on a daily basis, quoted last week as saying, we used to be a real estate company dabbling in technology. I think we're becoming a technology company dabbling in real estate now. So the nature of your businesses is changing too, and what are those businesses, right? Just like the architectural practice is undergoing change, and you know, so there's a lot of changes. I think we're sort of really at an interesting moment in time over this next period of 5 years or 10 years or so, where there's going to be new opportunities to sort that out. I don't think there's an easy answer, but there's more opportunity, I hope, coming, and more ways to make it practical to give you choice.
Yeah. There's one other thing I'd add to the IP kind of thought process, that most things are being built in a cloud platform now because it's easier to deal with that way, right? It's easier to deploy, keep people up to date, and everything else. Everything's a subscription, right, or a service. One of the things about the cloud is as you go into that as a business or even as a user, figure out who owns that data, because you can see from the extremes of, you know, GDPR, which is the European laws for privacy and data ownership, to what's going on in the U.S., to what's going on in some of the big tech firms. And, you know, and there's news this week from Apple about, you know, they think that folks like Facebook and Google are going way overboard on kind of cataloging all that data and owning it so that they know ourselves better than we do. But the point is, as you go to the cloud, think about who owns the data. And again, bad news first, if you want to own it as another part of your, you know, intellectual property, be upfront about it and get it out early so that you can figure out, maybe people won't agree to that. And if they won't, then maybe it's not the right business model. Maybe you need to look at the business model again, but don't let it linger till later.
So I'm not quite sure how to ask this, but you had said of the 100% of the project, it's 20/20, 80, 10/10,
Yeah.
whatever the ratio is, 12% if you're lucky. So there's that kind of direction, but aren't we starting with the premise that 100% of it comes from somewhere? And then I also look at the dinosaur, right? So like we're a dinosaur, but like where did that dinosaur come from? Like who's like what's allowing that dinosaur to continue to like lumber slowly and slowly? And then you had also pointed out that you're going to these places where all of a sudden you're talking about what I assume is some sort of design type technology that applies directly to real estate. So now the question is, and I'm not sure how to word this, so forgive me, but like what are we building technology for? Are we still building like technology for ourselves? And then the second question is leading the answer a little bit, like there's this where the money comes from the client side. Like are we starting to think about like building technology that starts to mend the gap so it is much more accessible in a sense, that where heaven forbid even the client is able to be doing design work with us?
Yeah, I think that would be the dream, right? I mean, the one thing that I've observed in my 25 years around AEC software is all this work that's gone into these tools is just increasing visibility throughout the entire process. We all know that we build a better world if better decisions are made earlier in the process, right, as early as possible by involving the most stakeholders, and technology is beginning to enable that. But I have to say that I don't support the term built tech as an example, because it's not really about the technology. It's really about the application of it, right, and how it's actually used and what difference it can make. So I try to think more, you know, I've been spending a lot of time in the lean space, right, and You know, there's been a lot of, you know, attempts to, last planner-based attempts to introduce something for lean in construction. That's great. They've served their purpose, I suppose. But ultimately, there'll be some other great solution there that's not just about software, that really figures out how you meld the approach, the process, the culture, and everything else that requires lean to be implemented successfully. So as investors, we're trying to figure out that piece of the puzzle too, not just the technology piece. Because Don mentioned this earlier, you know, the analogy that we use a lot, we have a lens on the market which has 3 basic components to it. I know it's a simple analogy, but it's a surfer, surfboard, and a wave. In that metaphor analog, right, the surfer is a team, the surfboard's a product, and the wave is a marketplace. And you really have to have all 3 of those to believe that you can build something substantial, make a difference as an investor. That's sort of our belief. They have to be in harmony, not any one thing. You could have a great piece of technology, but if the market's not really ready for it, doesn't know how to apply it, it's not going to do it. That's the wave. The wave is the missing ingredient all the time, right? It's not just the technology. It's also the people that can actually bring that technology to market, understand how to build the user interface, understand how to serve it to the market, what the business model approach is. Maybe it's open source to start or whatever it happens to be. So I think you have to have the right things in combination. But I do think, really, I'm just telling you that the money's coming into this industry to disrupt it. Whether people like it or not, or people agree with it or not, I'm just, you know, I just know the financial numbers fairly well. I've seen it. I've never seen anything like it in the last few years, and it's only picking up steam. So there's something happening.
Yeah.
How people take advantage of it is really going to be the question, right? This is a unique moment in time.
On the 80-10-10, just a quick answer there is the customer ultimately is always the owner or the group, you know, the institution that's you know, hiring a design team and an engineering team and a construction team. The challenge with designing tech for them historically, and it kind of remains, although there are some breakthroughs, is that they, you know, many owners, like, you know, the group that's going to build a museum in New York is going to build one museum in 50 years, right? So it's, you can't really build anything repeatable for them, right? So maybe the guys who build Marriott hotels will build, you know, 200 a year. That's somebody you might be able to work with. But the majority of owners are not building, you know, frequently building the same kind of facilities. Or often our community groups building one thing at one point in time in a unique location and for a unique project. So that that makes it hard to focus on the 100%. Instead, you know, you kind of focus on the supply chain.
Yeah, and we're seeing more owners that do repeatable buildings showing an interest in process and you know,
Yes.
process change driven by technology, because they're just starting to realize that, like, but this might be too specific of an example, but a guy I worked next to right when I first started in architecture spent a weekend drawing tiles in CAD for bathroom tiles, and like, yeah, it could have been a hatch pattern, it could have been a lot of other things, but like there was not a willingness to adopt process there, and also the technology really hadn't permeated the space. In that firm, and I think that there are certain owners now that care about that didn't a couple years ago, and we're seeing that more and more. Which, I mean, there's the money paying for the project, and that will drive a lot of the technology adoption.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I should take the dinosaur part, right?
Sure, dinosaur.
So dinosaur. So, but no, I take the dinosaur part and take the one that who are we developing the tech for, I think. So for the dinosaur part, the only way that dinosaurs are dead is like major change, and like it seems the major change is coming. Yeah. Brace yourself. So we will see about that. But honestly, like from my side, it's just like we don't want this dinosaur to go away, because like when the dinosaur goes away, who's going to just like be there? That's one side. The other side, I think about it. Okay, how much of the industry really is ran by this dinosaur or dinosaurs? What is the percentage of buildings that gets built in the US that architects, engineers in this level are even getting involved? You know, and then that comes to the part of who are we developing this technology for? I mean, especially with the cloud-based technologies that we can have now, with the web that opens up like access to this cloud-based technologies. I mean, for me, we are developing for everyone. And maybe we open it to them later when we are ready and we realize how to talk to them. But anything that we are developing recently, I really, first for ourselves to use it, then for the building industry to use it, and finally for people out there. I think like, I'm really interested in like, I mean, for a while they say like how, like, you know, the concept was to make anything desktop, like 3D printer, everything. Interestingly enough, now cloud is helping us to do that again, you know, to give access to everyone. So yeah, it's a very exciting point of time because of all this technology that you can develop something that has a functionality and then figure out, like by giving it different views to be useful for different users.
In architecture specifically, the constellation of software all kind of seems to orbit around, you know, one, maybe two kind of design and authoring platforms. So new stuff comes in the form of like, you know, plugins or, you know, some specific functionality that handled via import-export or something, but it's still kind of reliant on the kind of design and authorship environment that we're all familiar with. Is it gonna stay that way? Is there going to be a challenge to either that software or that model? And where will such a challenge come from?
It might be talking about my employer. I'm not really sure, but
Which is,
Let me guess.
you know,
which is your new employer,
yeah,
Autodesk, of
yeah,
course.
yeah. It's funny to have an Autodesk in your email address. It's every time I look at it, I'm like, wow, that's me. I guess there absolutely will be challenges and there will be change. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I do think one of the things we're seeing, and Jesse and I talk about this a lot, and I think you see it reflected, is if you look at companies like Oracle and companies like Autodesk and companies like Trimble, they're kind of waiting for these companies to get to a certain scale and product market fit or adoption or user base, and then they're kind of snapping them up. But it's both good and bad. I think it's good in that, you know, the tech has a chance to live on. It's been bad at times, or it's difficult at times, because it changes the entrepreneurial focus where you had the freedom, you know, whatever level of freedom you had to really go exactly after your vision. And we struggle with that, you know, as people who've been acquired. I've been acquired 3 times now, so it's, you know, I'm hoping to get it right one of these times. But, you know, I do think it will change, but I think that the more successful ones will end up becoming snapped up by these companies with very large balance sheets. But then you'll have breakthrough companies that, you know, will be the next big thing, and somebody will break through and use the capital markets. It's just a lot more difficult to use the capital markets than to, you know, to get to what we call an exit, right, through M&A.
Yeah, I would say I don't know what it is that's going to change it, that threaten the current franchises or change it, but something is.
Yeah.
And more likely it may be, rather than a better version of what's out there, it may be more somebody jumps the shark and changes it. You know, I think that CAD's become less relevant. I saw it born in the mid-'80s, as I said earlier. We won it at a door prize, you know, and so it's had an amazing run as a technology, not just the company, but that concept. And I don't know that that sustains the future, right? That's always, so I think as the business model changes, as the players change and other things are happening, and these new technologies come out, people are going to jump forward, and we're going to change how we design and build the built environment.
Start
I'm
more
convinced.
spec-driven,
And I
more
think
things
that's
like
actually the threat to those franchises versus some better version of Revit.
Yeah.
You could
Although if there is one, I'm interested, but I don't think that that's necessarily the strategy.
You asked the question we're all thinking about, which is like we see layer on top of layer being built on these things, and everyone here is pretty much building more layers on top of it. And there's only so many layers before like the chain breaks, and there's this. It's so complex at this point that the question is sort of what drives that. And you know, we go back and forth on like, is it the medium? Is it the computing medium? Obviously, we're in headsets all day, so we think it might be. We think there might be a better way to interface with 3D, and that might drive a new type of modeling tool. But I also think, you know, there might be a Revit 2 that is independent. There might be a Revit 2 that's internal. But I do think there's an increasing pull to that as we continue to build layers on top. So it comes up a lot in the office.
It won't come from the big companies. They're not innovators, right? You're asking, it's going to come from somebody here or somebody outside this industry or a team that's, people know the industry and then technologists from the outside have a whole different view of the world. I'm convinced that's where it comes from. Don't take it wrong, Don. I did my, you know, put my kids through college too. Autodesk did, but I mean, it's not going to come, like any large company, it's unlikely to come from within a large company.
No, absolutely.
It's going to come more organically from the market.
Cool. I think we have time for a couple more. There's one up there.
comment about how even though if we have the technology, but the industry is not catching up, then it's not really useful. And that really spoke to me because we are a tiny firm in Philadelphia, and we do a lot of high volume of single family, multi-family. We don't design towers, hospital. The clients we speak to and the people who work in the real estate industry selling houses, they're like decades behind in terms of understanding technology of what we do here. Although I do some research and development in the company, and still people don't really understand what we're doing, right? They don't even know what BIM stands for. So my question is, can you guys shed some light into how can I take what I've done today back to Philadelphia and start the initiative to maybe educate or even start implementing some of the replication for our clients?
Sure. I mean, I would put it, and I should be the last person to answer to, but I have a short one for you, is because when I was younger, I struggled with this concept. And I think you start to see the change when you accept part of your job is sales. Whatever you do, you're a salesperson. You know, it doesn't matter.
I like this part better.
Okay.
We're past the free stuff.
No, wait. You can sell an idea. It's not about money. The best salespeople were prophets in that sense, you know. They sell the idea, they sold the idea to so many people, right? Yeah. And then when you accept that, when you don't talk about yourself, the person who does the research and, you know, like, is responsible for that and other people don't understand, I think the life gets easier. Because you understand, okay, I do this stuff, and part of my job is to communicate to other people that what is the value here and how it can make their life better and buildings at the end of the day better. And I think one thing that helps a lot in convincing people that something is valuable is to look to what we really want to do. We are very good at saying, I made this technology, this makes like drawing this thing like 2 times faster. That's something okay, but if we can really say we made this thing that will make the buildings that we're living in better, yes. We will give a better experience to people along the time, we will help the whole thing. I think that is a much better sale point.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, I'd say also just have a, you know, I teach a lot about how to do process. So when you want to invest in something for your firm, you know, you do your homework, create a report, justify it, do the due diligence of talking to outside people, competitors, put that information in, because what someone who's going to grant you the ability, the resource, which is typically money, to go out and get the right kind of computers, the right kind of software, or the right subscriptions, is going to want to know that you did all your homework. So there's a, I'd be happy to share with you a checklist of the things you ought to do, right? That someone who you're going and asking $20,000, $4,000, or $400,000 for is typically going to wonder if you've done all those things. And if you've done them in advance, I think it's easier to get to yes. Let's try it.
To continue with the sales analogy, I mean, understand who you're selling to, in the sense of like what is the value that you're going to perceive this value. And I think a lot of us are technologists, and for a long time I'd go into a firm and be like, BIM is going to be amazing because you're going to have a centralized model. And I think that there's just such a gap in value to what the person you're talking to cares about. Right. And do research on their terms and what do they perceive as success, and just frame it in that context.
That's good advice. Cool. We have time for one more. We have a question up here in the front.
Thank you for the great discussion. Okay. So Brian said it's really hard to predict future in the morning, and I kind of like agree with him. And kind of like looking backwards from maybe since millennium, or like, the promises that we started realizing with the technology picking up like 95, and also like being in the building industry like early, like 2000s, I feel there remained a big gap with the promises and expectations and the building stock, right? That kind of like had happened. And I'm kind of like, I empathize with the dinosaur, but because I feel that it's gonna be the same for next 20 years. So I don't want to ask about the kind of like the prediction for future, but looking, past 2 decades maybe, do you see an inflection point, from your different kind of like perspectives that something could have happened and made an impact on the building stock? And I'm literally talking about the buildings that are being built as like end products, their environmental impact, their impact on cities and our lives, in a total sense. Anything that you can trace in probably longer, for you, more than 2 decades, but.
Okay.
It's a hard question.
That's a tough one.
Well, I don't know that I just think out 2 decades, but I think I said this earlier too, this is, I guess, just personal point of view. We don't really live in a sustainable world, right? We're kind of fooling ourselves right now, right? So there's some bigger forces at work here, I think, that ultimately drive bigger change. I don't know how it happens. I don't know when it happens, but we can't build to keep up with the population, right? No matter whether you believe any of these stats, we have so many people all moving into cities all over the world, many of which are coastal. Begin to continue the dialogue after that, So I think those are the changes that change how we design and build to a better world. The force is bigger than technology, that force us to think differently about business models and technologies and everything else. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I see sort of big clouds on the horizon. I'm sorry, as an investor, it's kind of an opportunity thing too. When you see that, right? Because there's wave, there's action out there, there's forces bigger than just the power of technology, what people want to sell. There's actually something else that's going to drive change bigger, and I think that's what drives the ultimate change.
And there are hopeful signs of change. So I live in the Boston area, and there's actually a $1 billion project now to leverage some work done by a design firm out of Holland who have become experts in helping the waterfront areas become more resistant or resilient, I think is the word they use, right? And instead of building a parking garage, that's gigantic and just on the edge of the waterfront, the examples that I saw were they put the parking garage partially underground, partially above ground, and they shape it so that if water overflows that area, because all of Holland actually is below sea level. I didn't know that till I read all this. And the water can, during a storm, which they have bad storms in the North Sea, they can empty the garage of cars, and the garage can actually fill up and become kind of a lake for a little while, and then there's a big green space for it to, and so Boston is actually undergoing, not Ray Flynn, but the mayor was talking about this $1 billion program that's starting now to do the same thing. So I think, cities, companies.
And this started, by the way, because last winter in Boston, whether it was well publicized or not, right, we had ice water running through the most expensive real estate streets in the city.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a disconnect in there if you think about that, right? That's kind of the example of the big forces at work, I think.
Yeah.
And a little bit different approach that I do think ties into environmental factors as well is, this is not in the last 20 years, this is in the last 5 or 10, but we are creating a better digital awareness of our environment. So there's sort of the digital layer now, and this is obvious for everyone in this room, but there's a digital layer now on top of the physical. But I think we're starting to see how that can drive different forms of empathy for different spaces, whether you start at something as basic as Google Maps and go as advanced as digital tourism. And I think that is going to, I'm going into the prediction business again, sorry, but that's going to inform a lot of how we might interact with space differently in the near term.
Yeah, let's talk after the it's going to be a long one.
I want to take this discussion, and as we kind of move into a conclusion, I want to be a little selfish here. And so when I introduced them, I said there's a common thread here, other than their attire. Obviously, the older you get a vest.
But I think it's a logo.
They're not investments, they're vests. That's what we call them in the office.
Yeah, did it work? No, but we got a vest.
It's kind of sad to have a vest for every investment. But.
There's also a common thread with all of us here. There's one that's not as obvious, right? We're all on the tech side and all that fun stuff, but we've all made a conscious decision to not go down a traditional architecture path or a traditional engineering path or so on and so forth, right? I could have been a typical designer and be doing mood boards right now, but I chose not to, right? And a lot of us here also chose not to. I have this dilemma of what is a career path for individuals like myself and individuals in this room, right? If I want to be a typical designer, I can go to my previous architecture firm, I just follow his or her path, and I know I can get somewhere near there. But for those of us that are on the AEC technology space, some at startups, some within firms, some have bounced back and forth, is there some career path advice that you can give to the audience? But then also, if there's individuals here that are need a little bit of extra courage to kind of start their own career path, like just as you guys have, can you guys kind of give some comments on that?
Well, if you want to start a business, you have to have a screw loose, that's for sure. That's a requirement. We like 1 versus 2, by the way. But I think, look, I think the most interesting investment proposals we see are people that are not sort of conforming to the traditional concept of a business. So maybe it's not a traditional architectural practice. You know, there's issues around licensure and accreditation, I realize, that make that a little more difficult than it sounds. But we see really interesting proposals now from people that it's kind of hard to figure out whether they're technology companies, whether they're AEC companies, whether they're construction companies. There's all different types of ways to attack the opportunity now. And I think being open to that, and if you're just starting your career, the chance to get yourself involved in one of those ventures is kind of interesting, right? I'm not against any normal career path, but as an entrepreneur, you know, you're always looking to take the risk, right, to try something really different, and usually something really dramatic or different happens from that. Could go bad, could go good, but generally speaking, that's where the interesting journey starts, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I have a vast, so, you know, I've been around for a while. I mean, technologists used to get locked into air-conditioned rooms, right, a long time ago. And I think you're very fortunate to be well-educated and, you know, interested or in love with technology at a time when the industry needs you really badly. So from a career perspective, you know, there's probably many ways you can go, but there's no shortage of firms like, you know, the firms up here looking for good people who want to either, you know, go out and try to change the future. I know that a lot of the firms themselves, from the folks who hosted us today to, you know, some of the bigger construction companies have their own innovation departments and innovation labs. So there's really no shortage of opportunity. And just kind of, you know, I would go back to Jesse's original comment, and I think Mustafa said it, use your network to kind of make sure you're making good decisions, both, you know, from a personal perspective and from a career perspective. But you can't really go wrong in, you know, CAD, BIM, VDC, AR, software development, you know, cloud. I mean, that stuff is just on fire, right? So there's never been a better time to be who we are.
Architects are really well suited for the entrepreneurial journey too. I think you can like work really long hours for very little pay, and you're very resilient and know how to program a little bit. And I think that is perfect.
That's a requirement.
It's
That's
perfect.
key.
And yeah, I mean, we joke about that all the time in the office because we have a lot of architects that work for us, and it's amazing how architects have formed this skill set that is very entrepreneurial inherently. I think that a lot of times the advice that we'll give is, you know, if you solve a problem that you have and sort of see what size that problem is for other people, and then it's sort of a decision on your part of how big you want to grow that. And I think we've had conversations about that here, but I think it does have to start with something you're solving for yourself, because then you can sort of build the tool in a way that has value from the start.
Sure. Yeah, and I just add one thing that I thought of when you were talking is, so if you want to kind of dip your toe in the water, the bigger tech firms like mine, you know, Autodesk, they have hundreds of openings.
Are you recruiting here now? Hey, what is this?
Yeah, don't do
I paid for that vest, not the Autodesk vest.
We have jobs too. No, I'm serious, there's just really no shortage of opportunity now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think doing it step by step is also important. There is like this theme of follow your dream thing. I don't think that's the best approach that you can go for. Consider your dream, find people who are doing that, hang out with them, work with them for a while, and see if your dream is real. Then follow that.
That's good
I think follow the potential that you have more than following your dream.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, that's the
really
important one for people who want to start, because I have seen people we just like, you know, we have this thing like follow your dream and you go and then you get depressed and then all this stuff. Yeah, don't do that.
That's good.
Cool. So I want to thank the panelists, not just for being here as a part of the discussion, but also for having the courage to step out of traditional career paths, just, you know, as we are here. But you guys have definitely taken it to yet another level beyond those of us in the audience. So I want to thank you guys for that, and thank you guys for being here.
Thank you.